Good evening. I declare the meeting of the Port Phillip City Council open, and I welcome members of the public that are here tonight. The City of Port Phillip respectfully acknowledges the Yalukit Willem clan of the Boomerang. We pay our respects to their elders, both past and present, and we acknowledge and uphold their traditional relationship to this land. Council has a local law that determines how this meeting will be conducted. There is a time allotted in tonight's agenda for public question time. During public question time, members of the public can ask specific questions on general matters other than those that are relating to a topic that's on the agenda for tonight. Members of the public are only to ask specific questions and shall not provide any statements or contextual comments relating to that question. Consequently, the official minutes of the meeting will only record the question asked and any response given. The number of questions that a member of the public may ask shall be at the discretion of the chairperson. There is an opportunity for members of the public to ask a question and/or make a comment on a specific item on tonight's agenda. This will be done prior to the council considering that item. We encourage questions or comments from the public that are directed through the Mayor, are not defamatory, abusive or objectionable in language or substance, but are rather presented in the spirit of mutual respect and council and the community. And we ask all speakers to abide by the direction of the Chair. If you wish to ask a question or speak to a report, please complete the blue form that's available at the table just outside the chamber and hand it to a staff member. And I encourage you to try and limit your questions to around 3 minutes and to avoid repeating any points that have already been made by other speakers. So please note that all council meetings are now being live streamed. That's what that lovely white thing is there. Live streaming and recording allows the community to watch and to listen to meetings in real time, providing greater access to council decision making and debate and improving the openness and transparency. The live stream of this meeting is available on Council's website, and the recording of this meeting will also be available to view on Council's website in about 48 hours' time. The cameras will film and record the councillors at this meeting. However, care is taken not to film or record images of members of the public. If a member of the public speaks or asks a question or makes a comment about an agenda item, they'll not be filmed, but their voice will be heard in the live stream and it'll be recorded. And please also note, in accordance with Council's local law, that this meeting cannot be audio or videotaped unless permissions granted by the Mayor. I'll go to the agenda. So item 1 is apologies. Councillors, do we have any apologies? We're all here tonight. Minutes of the previous meeting. Councillors, the minutes of the ordinary meeting held on the 19th of July 2017 have been circulated. Do you have any questions relating to those? No? If not, can I have a motion? Councillor Simic to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Copsey? I will now put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. We'll move to item 3, which is declarations of conflicts of interest. Councillors, anyone have a conflict of interest? I will declare at item 8.3, I will vacate the chair. And 8.3 is the event fireworks exemption. So I, Councillor Bernadine Voss, declare that in relation to item 8.3, event fireworks exemption, that I have a conflict of interest in this matter by way of an indirect interest by a close association. We'll move to item 4, which is petitions and joint letters. Councillors, we've got one petition tonight. Petition 1 is Bowen Lane, Melbourne. And we have no members of the public that have requested to speak. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? Councillor Pearl?
Reading my notes. You say in the item that we'll be advocating for a better position in item 2 there. Can you be specific on the actions in terms of the how we'll be advocating on behalf of that area and also the timeline involved.
Ms Ferris-Miles.
Through you, Madam Mayor. At our last council meeting on the 19th of July, there was a confidential matter that related to council's relationship with Melbourne Metro Rail Authority. That matter pertained to the working relationship that would occur between Melbourne Metro Rail Authority and the City of Port Phillip. It is through that partnership that Council has a role to play in terms of working with the authority on behalf of our community to advocate for, in regard to the traffic management proposals for the various stages of construction. And so Council officers are working very closely with the authority with each traffic management plan that comes before us to try and mitigate impacts on behalf of our community.
Thank you. Any further questions? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that or something else? Councillor Copsey to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Pearl to second. Councillor Copsey, would you like to speak to that motion? Councillor Pearl? No, thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Then I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you. Item 5 is the sealing schedule, and councillors, we don't have any documents requiring sealing. Item 6 is the public question time. And councillors, we've got 3 members of the public that have requested to speak. I'll call them in the order that they're on here. I'd like to ask Miss Vicky Myers, please, to come forward. And no, Miss Myers. I'll ask Mr. Craig Morris, please, to come forward. Welcome, Mr. Morris. If you could please, yes, sit there, pop on the microphone, turn it on and perhaps adjust it to...
Hello.
And please state your name and suburb for the record, please.
Thank you. Craig Morris. I'm here as the President of the Port Melbourne Bowling Club. Madam Mayor and councillors. I'm here to seek assistance from Council to help the Port Melbourne Bowling Club, which is 134 years old, and has been an institution of Port Melbourne for a long, long time. We need to evolve and we need to diversify if the club is to give back to the community more than what it can at the moment. For those that aren't aware of lawn bowls, we've got 2 traditional grass greens, which costs the club around $70,000 to $80,000 a year to maintain. So we try and open up to primary schools. El Park High had them there a couple of years ago. But unfortunately, with juniors and young kids, they damage the green. And it hurts us and hurts the club because it's more money you've got to invest. So we want to try and turn one of our grass greens into a synthetic green so that we can actually then open up the club to the primary schools. Port Melbourne Primary School can have it Mondays, Tuesdays El Park can have it. They can do hockey on it, they can do tunnel ball, what we did when we were kids or whatever. And just hopefully, get people involved in bowls, but to fully utilise the facilities. At the moment, we can't utilise it 365 days of the year. Wet weather comes in, we're restricted. Clubs that are succeeding in getting youth and diversifying their club have a grass green and a synthetic green, and they're getting youth involved in it, and we're not at Port Melbourne. We're getting by. I joined as president. I joined the club in 1983 as a 21-year-old. I joined as president 3 years ago. I put a 5-year strategy in place to improve the culture, improve the environment, to improve the financial position of the club, which was struggling at that time. We've done all of them, but we need to take a pretty significant leap. But unfortunately, to do that, there's some significant funds that need to go into initial infrastructure, but then going forward, the club will be able to maintain that infrastructure and open the doors up to more people in the community use. The local schools for disability, I did T-ball with them years ago. We can't do that on grass greens. We need to change one to a synthetic green. This is probably the start of a 2-year journey, but I hope Council will embrace that and support our goals. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morris. Councillor Gross, you wanted to ask Mr Morris a direct question?
Yeah, I've got two questions. How's your membership tracking? And on the artificial green, would you put lines on for other sports, or how would that work?
Unfortunately, from a lawn bowls point of view, you're restricted by the bowls compliance in regards to that, so we're restricted in regards to what we can do. We can put temporary nets for hockey and things like that, but not the lines. Okay. So there is some limitations because we have to comply with Australian Bowls Association.
Sure.
Our current membership now, when I joined, we had 2 Saturday pennant sides and 1 Tuesday winter side. We've now got 3 on Saturday and we've got 2 on Tuesday. Our social membership's probably increased by we've had 500 new social members over the last 3 years, but unfortunately we have a lot that don't come back. There's a lot of reasons, and I received a letter today from Council that I'm going to object to later on about parking restrictions. It is difficult. People drive from other areas outside of Port Melbourne, and parking restrictions actually turn people away from joining the club. But our membership is increasing. We've got some other things that we're doing. We've got acoustics in the club. If you've ever been in the club, the acoustics in there is terrible. You've got hard service, hard service, hard service. So I've lobbied federal government for a communities grant through there. They've got some grants for infrastructure, for soundproofing, Mr Michael Danby. So I'm working with all different areas to try and fix all of these little things up so that we can open the doors and grow the membership at a fairly significant rate.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr Morris.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, Mr Trail, just like to... You can take a seat now, Mr Morris. If you wouldn't mind addressing, we have definitely have a need for, more space for sport. I'm just wondering if you could speak to that offer and potential future 2-year program.
Through you, Madam Mayor, as the Manager of Open Space and Recreation, I'm happy to meet with the President and look at some planning on how to operate the facility. We do have one bowling green synthetic in the municipality at Albert Park VRI. That's about a 6 to 7 year old surface. It is now coming to the end of its useful life, so the club is already planning the relay of that. There is reduced maintenance on an annual basis, but after the 7-year period there's a renewal cost of about $180,000 to $200,000. So that planning needs to go in place. It does open up more opportunities for people with disabilities and younger people to benefit out of that type of service. So I'm more than happy to share our experiences with working with Albert Park VRI and work with the club about a plan going forward.
Thank you, Mr Trail. Any other questions, councillors, for Mr Trail on that speaker? No? Thank you. Ms Rhonda Small, please.
Thank you. Rhonda Small, St Kilda. Madam Mayor and Councillors, as you would all be very much aware, I'm sure, there was a VCAT directions hearing on the 7th of July in relation to the application by South Pacific Proprietary Limited to build a pavilion and licensed premises for up to 300 patrons on the Sea Baths rooftop. At that directions hearing, a request was made by the applicant to delay the next compulsory conference until after they hoped their application would go to council. And it was the date of the 16th of August was mentioned for that coming to council, but that would depend on the applicants receiving a consent under the Coastal Management Act, which they had hoped, they said, to receive by the end of July. So my question is it possible for council to confirm yet whether this application will come before it on the meeting of the 16th of August, or whether that's still unclear?
Thank you, Ms Small. I'll ask Ms Ferris-Miles, please, to...
Through you, Madam Mayor. What Ms Small has indicated is correct in regard to following the VCAT directions hearing. There was a request made to the state government for clarity on the minister's view on a request for the variation to the coastal consent. I can confirm that Council has received at 6 o'clock this evening that the Minister has refused that request from the applicant, and so now Council's lawyers are now liaising in regard to next steps. So we are now proposing to seek a further directions from hearing from VCAT as to how this matter will be resolved. That will mean that the Council report on the 16th of August will not proceed until we get some further clarity in regard to a discussion at VCAT, as we will need to know what the applicant proposes to do from here.
Thank you, Ms Ferris-Miles. Up to the minute information. There you go. Now, Vicky Myers, I believe, has arrived. Ms Myers? Welcome, Ms Myers. If you could please turn on the microphone and state your name and suburb for the record.
Vicky Myers, the suburb's Melbourne, but it's a St Kilda Road area. And the question I have is, I'm just interested in understanding why the City of Port Phillip doesn't enforce the Vic Road regulation regarding angle parking, which states that angle parking should be nose in, front in. I know this seems like quite a petty issue. Nose in rather than facing out. And are there any other regulations that the city doesn't enforce? Because I'd find it useful to know what they are.
Thank you, Ms Myers. I can say that we do enforce that, but maybe our parking officers don't. But Ms Blair, if you'd like to come forward and address that issue.
Through you, Madam Mayor, parking officers enforce the Victorian Road Rules and the Road Safety Act. We are able to exercise discretion when enforcing under these regulations, and if there is not a risk to public safety, then we sometimes do exercise that discretion. And so one of the areas where we have exercise that discretion is in relation to the parking that was described, and also another example would be on occasions when cars have blocked driveways. We typically enforce when they're obstructing pedestrians and or if there's been a complaint made. Thank you, Ms Blair. I'm wondering, Ms Myers, have you asked for these to be enforced?
I've asked for a reason, and that is because on Arthur Street, just off Queen's Road, between Queen's Road and St Kilda Road, it seems to have become something of a fashion for vehicles to be parking front out. And I've taken pictures of 3 at a time within 10 metres. And the simple fact is, to get in, they're obviously engaging in significant manoeuvres, and then to get out, they're pulling out into oncoming traffic. And so I've just been wondering why. I've never seen a ticket on them, and that has varied from massive, great big Toyota Hiluxes to other cars, because they see someone parked there and think, oh, I'll park that way because it'll be a quick exit.
Thank you, Ms Myers. Maybe Ms Blair could have a quick chat about the actual location. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There are no more members of the public that have requested to speak, councillors, so we'll move to councillor question time. Councillors, are there any questions of the officers? Councillor Simic.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In February, Vic Roads conducted a survey to measure residents' support for truck curfews on Beaconsfield Parade, Ormond Esplanade and Beach Road. I asked a similar question in May, and I'm wondering whether officers have received the outcome of the survey. If not, if the officers are aware of when the findings of the survey will be made available.
Ms Ferris-Miles.
Through you, Madam Mayor. So officers have continued to ask for that information from Vic Roads, but I can confirm that we are yet to receive it. The Mayor has recently had a meeting with the CEO of Vic Roads, Mr John Merritt, and again requested receipt of that information. We are aware that Vic Roads have advised that there were some technical issues with that survey, But actually today we've just drafted a further letter for the Mayor to write again to the CEO of Vic Roads requesting the information as a follow-up.
Thank you, Ms Ferris-Miles. Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Copsey.
Thank you. After recently finding a homophobic flyer in their letterboxes, residents of St Kilda have contacted me to express their concern and disgust. That flyer criticised city councils that show support for diversity and inclusion, and particularly for our LGBTIQ community members. So I'm biting because it's important to stand up against this sort of rubbish. My question for officers is, what actions is the City of Port Phillip currently taking to support our LGBTIQ community, and particularly for marriage equality?
Thank you, Ms Jeffs.
Through you, Madam Mayor, City of Port Phillip has a long and proud history of supporting LGBTIQ communities. So I'm just going to outline a few of the activities and investments that Council makes each year. Each year Council flies the rainbow flag for one full week at St Kilda, South Melbourne and Port Melbourne Town Halls in the week leading up to Pride March. We are, well, I like to think that we're the first accredited council to be accredited for Rainbow Tick for our home and community care program. So there are a couple of other councils. I think we were first, and we're just going through the re-accreditation process now. So that takes an inclusive approach to our home and community care program. Council recently invested in the order of $13 million in support of the Pride Centre. We have quite an extensive staff engagement program that supports and encourages LGBTIQ staff, including recently International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biphobia, Ida Hobbit Day. So we held an event which was quite successful. So, and probably I think the list goes on. In 2015, there's a council resolution supporting marriage equality, and letters were written to a whole range of federal and state ministers following that council resolution. And I did forget that we are the primary sponsor of the Pride March here in Fitzroy Street, and this coming financial year that will involve $65,000 as well as $10,000 in kind.
So just to follow up, it's obviously very timely, and it's an impressive list, and we are obviously very proud of our LGBTIQ community and providing support and embracing diversity. My follow-up question, particularly in relation to marriage equality, is what other actions could Council take to publicly reaffirm and communicate our support for marriage equality at this time?
Through you, Madam Mayor, there aren't any current additional activities. There are ideas about other councils of flying flags. There are lighting, footpath treatments that could be done. It's fair to say that none of these ideas have been progressed to a project at this point, and don't really sit in Council's program going forward. So the extensive list that I listed is the extent of our program at the moment.
So I'll take this opportunity to foreshadow a future motion that reaffirms the City of Port Phillip's support for marriage equality and asks the organisation to celebrate that commitment publicly. Everybody should be able to marry the person that they love, and the City of Port Phillip is proud to stand up for the rights of our LGBTI community, especially in the face of bigotry and hatred. Thank you, Ms Jeffs.
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. Any further questions, councillors? I have one. I'd just like to ask on street cleaning and wanted to understand how do we know that the streets are cleaned every 2 weeks, and what auditing process is done to sort of monitor that?
In relation to how do we know the streets have been cleaned, we have internal auditors from a different area of the street and beach cleaning who undertake fortnightly audits on a random sample of streets across the municipality, and that also includes auditing of our beach cleaning as well. So that's random and that's assessed against some specific criteria. In relation to how do we know how often we clean the streets, we're currently in a process of reviewing and assessing what our frequency of cleaning of streets is. That's been a lengthy task because currently that's not something that is computerised. It's manually done, so there's been quite a task in manually backtracking and recording and putting that in. That data will then be used to help inform the Clean Streets review that Council currently has in its Council plan for Year 2.
Thank you, Ms Blair. Any further questions, councillors? Then we'll move on to item 8, which is the presentation of reports. First of all, I'll go to 8.1. 8.1 is the CEO report, and we don't have any members of the public that have requested to speak to the CEO report. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers for the CEO report? Councillor Simic?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Referring to page 13, where at the top it states, so firstly I'd like to thank the organisation for and the CEO for reorganising the CEO report in light of our council plan. I'm just wondering about the new structure of the CEO report. And at the top of page 13 it says that 98% of council plan actions are on track, 87 out of 89 actions. I'm just wondering if there's a place where there's further detail with respect to which projects are on track, how they're tracking, and which projects are currently not on track.
Mr Carroll.
Through you, Madam Mayor. First, I'd like to clarify we're still in transition. This is the final report against the old council plan, but we have noted in here the work that's been done on the new council plan and what the structure looks like. When we report next, we'll have an initial change in structure to reflect the new council plan. I need to work on that more closely with the CEO in his report, and that might evolve over time, over the next 6 months or so until we really nail it down, but definitely the intention is to reflect the new council plan going forward. In terms of the council plan actions, in the existing council plan, there's a range of actions that are listed, not necessarily projects, because we also have the project portfolio. In the back section of the report, you can get a bit of a list of a summary of the highlights of how we've gone against some of the major projects. And we do normally report on, and if it's not in here, I can provide it separately, how we're tracking against the overall project portfolio, which was around, for the priority projects off memory, it was around 90% on track, and probably a little bit less on the whole portfolio. But in terms of the council plan actions, some of those end up being projects, but some of them are more operational kind of initiatives. There is a detailed listing of those available, so I can provide that separately in terms of how we're progressing against all of those. What we have tried to do is list out the exceptions in the report, so where we're not actually, the ones we're not tracking or we haven't tracked as we liked.
Councillors, any further questions? I have a couple. On the budget versus actuals, there's a number of budgeted items in there that are zero. I'm just wondering, for example, the precinct program, St Kilda Road Safety Improvement Program, just wondering if you could speak to why they have no budget, please. The CCT, yep.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I'm just checking that table now.
The last page, for example.
The last page, 20, 21 and 22. Generally, the budget would refer... I'll have to check those specific ones that you've raised, because there's a couple there that don't seem quite right to me. But generally, the budget refers to what was actually set in the annual budget for 16-17 at the start of the year. And sometimes projects are set, or sometimes projects happen during the year. There was no budget set for them. We update that in the forecast, which was reported on a monthly basis. The budget here refers to what was initially set at the start of the year. In terms of the actual, it may well be that some of those projects didn't progress. So while there may have been a budget, they didn't actually progress, so there was no money spent. But there's a couple here, like Albert Park stormwater harvesting, where I did think we did have some money against those. So I'll just need to double check what's happened there.
Thank you. And just wanted to flesh out a little bit about the valuation system delay. Can you explain why an additional $42,000 is required due to the vendor being late?
Through you, Madam Mayor. This was a complicated project. Obviously, valuation system critical for the council in terms of making sure we've got accurate information on the basis of levying rates. Core system in terms of information that we also need to provide to the Valuer General to show that we've got appropriate processes and systems to validate our rating processes. Our system was end of life. We've gone with the system that's used by the majority of the rest of the sector, but it's midway through an upgrade during the process of us implementing. So there's been some new functionality that's been implemented by the vendor during the process that hasn't been fully tested and wasn't fully working when we implemented it. There's also some, on our side, there's also some much more detailed data cleansing and manipulation that was required to move the data across and put it into the new system. We've worked very closely with the vendor during this time period and worked collaboratively to deal with issues on both sides. And we've had a lessons learned debrief with them, and I'm getting a project closure report which will provide some more detail around exactly the reasons why and the lessons from that project. But overall, I'm pleased to say that it has been delivered, it is working, and it's helped reduce a significant risk that the council was facing with the existing system being unsupported and about to fall over.
And one further question from me. It's really probably a congratulations. I note the property service team getting ahead of the planned progress, and it's really great to see. I'm wondering, is that going to be kept up? Are we going to continue to see great results there?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, I think the team has worked exceptionally hard over the past 2 years, dealing with a range of unscheduled, high priority and much more difficult tasks than we expected, with the Stoke House, the Palais, Donovan's, ongoing negotiations with the Vineyard. That's made, and the Pride Centre, which we're particularly proud of. But that has meant that we've found it difficult to keep up on a range of other business as usual kind of projects. We've done a bit of a restructure in the team in the past 6 months. We've got some additional resourcing. We've also reorganised and focusing more on our policy and our processes. I'm sure it's still a very challenging program over the next 12 months. We've got a high volume, more than we'd normally have. But the team is really stepping up to the challenge and doing a great job.
Thank you, Mr Carroll. Councillors, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that or something else? Councillor Gross to move. Councillor Crawford to second. Councillor Gross, would you like to speak to the motion? Councillor Crawford, no? Would anyone else like to speak? Did you want to speak at all, Councillor Gross? Otherwise,
it's situation usual. It's a very comprehensive report of a very active organisation. If there was one highlight, it was an award for annual report, so I think that needs to be highlighted. But yeah, I've got nothing to add other than it's another good report and things seem to be tracking.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Then I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Move to 8.2, and which is the Palais Theatre. Councillors, we've got one member of the public that's requested to speak to the Palais Theatre, the Fair Competition and Confidentiality Policy. Mr. Peter Holland, please.
Peter Holland, St Kilda. This policy, of course, is to encourage promoters other than Live Nation to use the Palais, and I'm suggesting that Council defers this and asks those other promoters their opinion of this policy. We all want the Palais to succeed. It was only 3 years ago that the Palais was under threat of being closed down permanently, and Council and the community can be proud of the fact that we saved the Palais. We got emergency funding from the Labor government and a long-term tenant, Live Nation. But one of the issues now is that in the old days, the Palais under Caroline was only used 25 times a year. Neil Croker raised that to about 125, and Live Nation have, I think, a similar sort of target. But will they succeed? I'm concerned that while it's early days yet, there's some worrying signs. I've given a list of the gigs that perhaps could or should have been at the Palais that have gone elsewhere, such as KD Lang playing the plenary rather than the Palais. The promoters seem to be using the Forum, Margaret Court, Crown and Hamer Hall, especially the big three, Frontier, Michael Chugg and Paul Dainty. There's a couple of reasons for this possibly. One is that Live Nation have significantly increased their fees, but the major issue is probably that promoters are worried about sharing confidential information with Live Nation, which is not just a neutral operator like Neil Croker was, but also a rival promoter. And the aim of the policy is to address this sort of issue. Now, I don't have the expertise to assess the policy, but I know that it's standard ACCC practice when there's a monopoly or a confidentiality issue and a proposed solution to ask the competitors, to ask the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of the solution. And I think that that's what we should be doing. We haven't done that yet. So I'm suggesting that Council defer this and ask the officers to contact the promoters and give a report on what the promoters think of our draft policy. Does it assuage their concerns? How can it be improved? And I quote as my authority Aristotle, who famously said, if you want to know whether the shoe fits a man, you ask the man who wears it, not the man who made it. I think that Council will be much better informed if they ask the promoters whether this shoe fits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Holland. I will note in 5.1 it does say that Live Nation have contacted current and past hirers of the venue, plus parties they've identified as likely future hirers. So they have consulted whether you consider hirers and promoters different things, but they have done that. So it was sent to over 70 recipients from 65 organisations for feedback. I'll open that up for questions. Councillor Simic.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can I just ask a question with respect to the email that was sent, if the officers have any insight whether any responses were received and what the responses were?
Would you please repeat that? I'm not sure anyone heard you.
Sorry about that. I thought that was... Thanks, Andrew. Andrew heard me. With respect to the email that was sent on the 15th of June by Live Nation, would officers be able to provide any feedback on whether any responses were received to the email and what the responses said, if possible at all?
Through you, Madam Mayor, there was one response and it seemed to be a misreading of the policy. So we didn't feel that that one response required any change to the policy.
Thank you. Councillor Crawford.
This is an area that I don't know a lot about around this booking policy. I guess Mr Holland has raised some questions for me, though. If we haven't received any feedback from the various bodies that may hire the venue, do we feel sure that this policy we are to vote on tonight will, encourage people to, because obviously we want the Palais to be successful?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's not uncommon for no responses to be received when an engagement occurs with any group, any community, and often it's when there are no problems that you don't hear anything back. So the measure of success is often the opportunity to provide input rather than the feedback received. So the fact that it was sent out, and we know that it was sent out to such a wide range of old and current and past promoters and users of the Palais, and the fact that nobody had any key problems that were raised with the policy, in addition to the fact that it's a standard policy. The booking arrangements and the policy that is in place is standard to the industry, and so it's not suggesting anything or proposing anything that's not commonly used elsewhere. Indicates that I think that the opportunity was there, and the fact that it wasn't taken up is not an indication of the failure of that engagement.
If I may, through you, Madam Mayor, just add to that. I think the key thing to note as well is that this policy is an addition, it's a special obligation that you wouldn't normally see in these types of arrangements. There are other mechanisms that govern unfair competition that are available. We have heard previously from some members of the community they have concerns about whether people would actually ever use those mechanisms or not, but they are available. They do govern how Live Nation needs to operate, and this policy is an additional protection over and above that. I'd also like to note that the panel did comprise some very well qualified people to provide advice on whether it was a fit for purpose policy and complied with the objectives. Andrew Bell is a former Assistant Director of Enforcement at the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, so very well practiced in competition law and issues. Greg Randall, who was involved in the leasing process, is also a very experienced venue operator, including running these types of policies and booking, supported by Rob Robertson, also a very experienced operator. I think part of the success in demonstrating what's been happening here is the shows that are actually happening, even though the venue's not fully completed. Ms McNeil can probably talk a little bit about how many shows have actually been booked, but there are a wide variety of promoters who are using the facility. There were some concerns raised by those competitors that were discussed previously when the leasing process happened, and it's not unusual or unexpected that they may still have some concerns. But the venue isn't actually finished yet, and some of the additional things, and once it's settled, we expect to see even further uplift in patronage from a wide variety of hirers.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. Councillor Brand.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to follow this up a bit too. The policy itself looks comprehensive, and to a non-expert eye like mine, impressive, and I hope that what Ms McNeil is saying about the settling in problems and the projections is true. But it does worry me that if you were a promoter and had a problem with Live Nation, with Live Nation's actual practice, I could conceive it might be a disincentive if you're asked directly by Live Nation to comment on the practices that they might be carrying out that are prejudicial to yourself as a promoter. I'm asking a question. So I'm asking, sorry, it's a long...
I'll address that. Please get to your question,
yes.
Councillor Brand.
what is the actual sort of what is the process of this survey? Are people being is Live Nation actually doing the survey, or is there a role for the expert panel that is assessing this, that they should be maybe doing more of a survey themselves? Is there a possible role there that would actually be an independent and sort of outside body having giving an opportunity to promoters to actually sort of air possible grievances that they might not want to...
Through you, Madam Mayor, can I just get Mr Carroll or Ms McNeil to just clarify one thing? Is the requirement in the lease to prepare a policy, and is there another requirement to consult on the preparation of that policy? So is there a requirement in the lease to consult, or is the requirement just to prepare a policy? So have they met the requirements of the lease?
Correct. Through you, Madam Mayor, that's correct.
Okay,
Councillor Brand, does that answer your question?
It answers part of it, except that is there a requirement that our assessment panel consults?
Through you, Madam Mayor, there is no requirement, there was no particular requirement around consultation, but we did engage strongly with Live Nation to develop a process that we were comfortable with, that we felt provided the industry an opportunity that Live Nation were prepared to undertake, and that the panel, in their independent, in their opinion, satisfied the requirement for review. So the other mechanisms that are in place, though, is that the lease provides council with the ability to audit what is happening down with the Palais, including any complaints that are made around promoters' access and that kind of thing. So if there was a situation in future where we heard that promoters felt they weren't being given a fair go, or that they were being acted against, then we would be able to investigate that. So that is a strong mechanism in the lease. And also there are a number of other mechanisms. So this policy isn't designed to work alone, it's designed to work in combination with a number of mechanisms. There is also recourse under law. So this is really supporting what is already a requirement under law.
Thank you. Is it a follow-up,
yes,
Councillor Brand?
Follow-up question. Has there been anybody in this assessment of this booking policy, anyone a direct expert through engagement, and actually an experienced expert, experienced person involved in promotion of live music, who has been consulted on whether this booking policy is a good booking policy?
Through you.
Thank you. Excuse me, councillors. You've asked a question, Councillor Brand. We'll hear from Ms McNeil. Thank you.
Through you, Madam Mayor, the expertise of the panel was very carefully selected, and we took into consideration not having direct competition, direct competitors in the panel. So it was very difficult to get a panel that had independence from direct involvement with the Palais and a potential direct conflict of interest. And so we didn't have people who were directly involved in the industry, but were considered to have very relevant and very extensive expertise in the area that would be able to provide the appropriate feedback.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Gross.
Look, I just wanted to tease out some of the changes and protections that have been made by the panel. I should say I know Greg Randall. I think he's perfectly equipped to be on a panel that examines these things. But if I've got it right, yes, Live Nation are vertically integrated. Yes, we have an issue with competition and competitive neutrality. but the three big protections, or the protections aren't, could you please elaborate if I get them wrong, are an agreement for confidentiality, 150 days for a minimum fee, and also that this pencil and challenge system, which I sort of don't understand. They're the big three protections for competitors of a vertically integrated Live Nation. Is that correct?
Yes, through you, Madam Mayor, that is correct. So they are the key protections. We also have the additional protection of that it is a small industry where we know that they all need to work together and that this is not an unusual situation. There are many venues that are managed in the same way with venue operators also being promoters, and it's not an uncommon situation. And also, we know that the Palais has been taking bookings, so the evidence is there that this is not a problem, that the industry is booking the Palais as expected, including the promoters that you would expect to see. There's been around 44 shows booked within the next 5 months, and that reflects that's in spite of the Palais being closed for renovations for 5 months and then having intermittent modifications still underway, being closed entirely for July. So there is a lot of activity in spite of the fact that the Palais is gearing up again. And so the previous operator had a range of about 80 to 120 shows. So the fact that we've already got 44 over the next 5 months is a very good indication. I've seen the forward booking program and it's looking very healthy. It's a range of international, national and local.
If I may, Madam Mayor, I think there's some additional protection. So yes, Ms McNeil talked about self-interest, which is a very important factor in this. But also there's the ability for, as Ms McNeil outlined earlier, for us to audit and review processes and complaints, and the ultimate sanction being that we can terminate the lease if it's repeated behaviour. So there's some fairly significant protections in there, and there's also requirements around operating at arm's length. Those other business entities, it's actually an advantage for us in some ways that when the theatre is having dark days, as they call it, in terms of downtime, that if there are availability, that they can draw on content to help actually increase the utilisation of the theatre over time, increase the economic and the community benefits from having a well-utilised theatre with a great range of content from a great range of hirers.
Thank you, Mr Carroll. Councillor Bond, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, for the benefit of Councillor Brand, can you outline the credentials of Greg Randall? From memory, he had spent many years, was it at the Arts Centre and the Music Bowl, booking all these same types of bands that are coming to, or we hope to come to, the Palais for 8-9 years or something like that. So he does have the experience in that area that we need on the panel, and with the benefit of not being a current competitor at the moment.
Through you, Madam Mayor, as noted in the report, Greg Randall's experience includes over 10 years as Director of Programming for Arts Centre Melbourne, that's the Victorian Arts Centre, and 3 years as Director of Glen Street Theatre in Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Savinkov. Councillors, any other questions for the officers? Councillor Pearl.
Very quick one on 3.6 compliance, which was mentioned just a minute ago. So Live Nation to provide an annual report on its compliance of the policy. So basically self-reporting their compliance. We have the right to audit. How would we go about that? What's the frequency going to be? How do we ensure that they're complying, other than feedback we should get through the community? But how are we going to ensure that they're complying with this policy to ensure that we're getting the best outcome for our community?
Through you, Madam Mayor, we've been working very closely with Live Nation to set up this transition period into the new lease, and part of that is working through the annual reporting format what will be included in those, and also contemplation about compliance and how we monitor compliance. I think initially we would be looking at responding to complaints rather than a stringent auditing process, but I think that would evolve if it turned out that there was problems that we needed to manage. So partly we will need to respond to what is required, but there are broad-ranging abilities under this lease to audit and ask for reporting. So, but we do have a very good relationship with Live Nation, and they are working to provide what we need in reporting.
Thank you. Any further questions, councillors? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Councillor Bond to move, Councillor Gross to second. Councillor Bond, would you like to speak to it?
Yeah, as we've heard tonight, I think the officers spoke about there's 45 shows booked for the next 5 months. If that was to continue over a full 12 months, or we got that sort of average, you'd be looking at present 108 shows over a full 12 months, which is not far below where the previous operator was. I think Mr Holland, in his email to us earlier today, said that one of the reasons that the place is struggling is because Live Nation are charging more than the previous operator, but that's not surprising given Live Nation are paying rent and contributing to the upkeep of the building, whereas the previous operator did neither of those. The quality of the acts we're seeing there, Ice House have got a couple of shows coming up, Adamant, Boney End, Alarmist, Morissette, Village People, so the quality of the shows we're seeing there are as equal to any other venue in Melbourne at the moment, so commend this policy and look forward to the Palais getting better and better as the maintenance is completed and we get to see the full Palais in operation.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Councillor Gross?
So I've lived through a time when the Palais had 25 bookings a year, and it's devastating for Ackland Street. And so I'm really excited by the notion that it is going to be fully booked. Having said that, I thought that Mr Holland's letter was incredibly plausible, and but I just would say this, that the panel have made real and tangible changes, that those real and tangible changes provide real protections for admittedly a vertically integrated organisation. I'm really heartened by the membership of the panel. Having an anti-competitive person plus Mr Randall, who I actually know and know his experience, and it is lifelong, and at a very senior level. He consults all throughout Southeast Asia, so he's quite an eminent person. And I think that, people say critical things about council, that we're slow and stuff, but it was a really good process that we had this independent panel, and they made real and tangible changes to the arrangements. So I'm really confident, apart from the issue of vested interests, Live Nation have a vested interest in keeping the place full and vibrant. So I'm really confident that the panel was well appointed, that the panel did their job, that the community's interests are protected, and I thank Mr Holland for continuing to raise these issues because, they need to be raised, and there is vertical integration with Live Nation. So, I'm really excited that we're taking the next step.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Councillor Copsey?
Yes, just echo that. We appreciate that the significant community interest in the Palais, there's significant council interest in the Palais. It's a beautiful venue, and it's great to see it hosting shows again and winding back up. This requirement under the lease was introduced in response to the very welcome community scrutiny of in the interest of a fair and competitive process for bookings at the venue. I'm confident that the panel that was appointed had the relevant expertise and that we've come to a good I'm confident with this policy as a starting point, but of course Council has the ability to evaluate how this is working out, and if there are concerns, rest assured, I'm just as interested in making sure that we see a diverse and vibrant programming schedule at the Palais, and I look forward to attending some of it.
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. Councillor Brand.
I find Mr Holland's query sort of plausible enough for me. I've not read his email actually, but I find it plausible enough for me to suggest that we should actually, well, I would propose an alternative, an amendment to this motion. I think an amendment to defer it.
Foreshadowing.
That's foreshadowing.
You will foreshadow in the event.
In the event.
That it fails.
That it fails. That this one fails. Yes. Yes. So I'd be actually. I'm proposing a motion that would override this one.
No, we have a live motion now.
We have a
Councillor
live
Brand
motion now.
that's been
Okay.
moved and seconded, and this is what we're debating.
What I would ask for then would be to say I would should this one not get up, I would suggest that we have a motion which is essentially the same as this motion, but defers it for a suitable period of say 3 weeks or a month, for the panel to actually go and talk to potential promoters about their experience with actually using the Live Nation system. I don't think that would be a problem that would override anything else which has been said in the report. I just think it would add to fill a potential gap that we have in our knowledge and in our understanding, and I would say in our confidence that this is going as well as it could.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Would anyone else like to speak to this motion? Councillor Baxter.
I'd just like to say that I do also. I was slightly worried about some of the things that that Mr. Holland had brought up, but hearing how this policy by itself doesn't necessarily guarantee all the things that we're looking for. That it's part of a framework of different policies, including the lease and our rights under that, and the legal framework has made me feel a lot more secure in that. So I'm happy to support.
Thank you, Councillor Baxter. Anyone else like to speak? If not, Councillor Bond, would you like to close? No? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you. All those against? Thank you. Now we'll move to item 8.3, which is the event fireworks exemption. Councillors, I just wanted to declare that in relation to the item 8.3, event fireworks exemption, that I have a conflict of interest in this matter by way of an indirect interest by close association. So before I leave the chamber, we need to appoint a temporary chair. So I need a motion. Councillor Gross.
I'd like to move that the Deputy Mayor chair this session for this resolution.
Councillor Copsey, yes. Councillor Simic to second. Then I'll put that. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. I will depart.
So, councillors, we're at report 8.3. Event fireworks exemption. There are no members of the public who have requested to speak to this item. Do any councillors have questions of the officers in relation to this report? Councillor Simic.
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. With relation to the fireworks that were approved in 2016, were there any problems with the fireworks that were conducted? And are there any issues in the officer's view with fireworks being conducted again?
Mr Trail, Ms Pritchard.
Through you, Madam Mayor. Last year there were no issues with the fireworks, there were no complaints and no impacts on assets either. The same operator's running it this year, and we expect the same outcome.
Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Brand?
There was one requirement that was asked of the operators in 2016, which was to send to email all pet owners in 2 kilometres radius or something, which doesn't seem to be in the SMS, was it? Which doesn't seem to be in the conditions now. Can you just comment on that?
Through you, Madam Mayor. Last year we investigated whether that was possible, and it actually wasn't possible, which is why it's been taken out of the conditions this year.
Any further questions? Then, councillors, we have an officer's recommendation. Would someone like to move this or something different? Councillor Pearl to move, Councillor Bond to second. Councillor Pearl, do you wish to speak to this motion? Councillor Bond? Would any other councillor wish to speak? Councillor Brand?
Yes, I just want to say how much I support fireworks on mainly a sentimental and nostalgic basis. And I just want to say, if anybody can be bothered going through all of the hoops and hurdles that are put in front of them to get, I think, quite valid ones, it's a really pretty thorough set of protections and safety measures that have to be put in place. If anybody, any organisation is, has the will to go through all of that, then I really commend them for doing it. Pardon?
Any other councillor wish to speak to this motion? Councillor Pearl, do you wish to close?
I couldn't have said that better myself. I'll rest that. Thanks, Councillor Brand.
All right. Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's passed unanimously. That concludes this item. Get Councillor Voss back in.
Thank you. Now we'll move on to item 8.4, which is the Footpath Trading and Tobacco Act Amendment. We have no members of the public that have requested to speak to this item. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? There are none. Councillors, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that or something else? Councillor Bond to move the officer's recommendation. Councillor Crawford to second. Councillor Bond, would you like to speak to?
Yes, very briefly. Support this recommendation, as I think the last thing we wish to see on our streets as we walk down Ackland Street or Bay Street or Fitzroy Street is these 2.1 metre high transparent blinds all the way down the street. It would be a real blight on our streets. So I support the recommendations of the officers with these not to be included in there.
Thank you. Councillor Crawford, would you like to speak to the motion? Would anyone else like to speak? Councillor Brand?
I would like to speak. Well, I did some reading on the plane. Yes, I support the motion. I was toing and froing between various possibilities, but I think one of the most important features of this recommendation is that it puts us in line with the policies of the City of Melbourne and the City of Yarra. And I just think it's really important that that the whole of inner Melbourne, and maybe the whole of Melbourne, but the whole of inner Melbourne as a sort of an entity, has a common practice and has a common way of doing this sort of street life on central Melbourne streets. And this is the way that we do it. It might not be the ideal way of doing it, might not be the most economically advantageous way of doing it, but it is the way that we do it, and I think it's sensible, enforceable, understandable, policeable, and ultimately it'll be a good outcome, doable.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Councillor Copsey.
I'd like to thank the officers for the work that I know has gone into preparation for this. It's a major change for businesses in our area, but it's a trend that's been accelerating, is making sure that we have smoke-free spaces for people in the community to enjoy. And I know that the officers, in addition to doing what's been required by this change in legislation, are taking a very proactive approach to education and support for our local businesses, which I applaud, and that we've also taken time to consider any potential litter impacts from cigarette butts, and that we're taking some proactive steps to curb that potential issue. So thank you very much for all the work that's gone in, and all the best with the implementation of this.
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. Anybody else wanting to speak? Councillor Bond, would you like to close? No? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Now we'll move to... Then we will move to 8.5, councillors. 112 Salmon Street, Port Melbourne. Just for the members of the public, we did have a forum today in which we heard from many from the members of the public that wanted to speak. So, and there have been no members that have requested to speak to this item. So, but councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? There are none. Then we have an officer's recommendation. Councillors, do I have a mover for that? Councillor Simic to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Gross, I can see you behind there. Thank you. Councillor Simic, would you like to speak to the motion?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just very briefly, this application is in an area where there are significant changes coming, already taking place, and will be into the future. Support the officer's recommendation. The application itself does not meet broader considerations around the Fisherman's Bend vision and what we want to achieve in the area. It's incredibly important for us to keep a watching brief on what expectations a future community of Fisherman's Bend would want. While this application provides quite a bit of open space within the design, it doesn't seem like it is in a place, in a position to actually be reflective of what's required in the area. So wholeheartedly support, endorse the officer's recommendations.
Thank you, Councillor Simic. Councillor Gross.
No, I don't wish to speak, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Brand.
I would love to speak on this at length, but I won't. I'll just speak a little bit. Yes, this application. I fully support the motion. It's a site that has significant heritage structures on it, important, unique heritage industrial structures on it, and I would say that this, the proposed development, really pays no regard to the historical context and the heritage constraints that might be acknowledged or that might influence the design. There's no sign of that at all. In fact, the only thing really, I suppose, the weird site constraint that actually has influenced this development proposal is the power lines, under which there is actually a very interesting and great-looking park proposed. And I just want to note the importance of every time, any opportunity we have in developing Fisherman's Bend, of actually being influenced by the historical uses of the place, accepting as a creative positive the constraints that heritage might put on a place, and just note that the policy that underpinning this particular development is that the whole site is bulldozed of any of that, and that the one single constraint that has been imposed on it by the historical use of the place is the one thing which has turned up something sort of quite interesting in this development proposal, which is the park.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Councillor Bond.
I guess this is the Mary Celeste of planning applications, in that it's a ghost application that the applicant has no intention of actually building or acting on should he receive a permit for this. It's been submitted out of frustration at the lack of action from the state government on Fisherman's Bend, and he's put it in just to force the state government's hand here to either purchase his property or give him some sort of certainty. He's, as he stated at the planning forum earlier today, they're sick of sitting around waiting for someone to come and speak to them, whether it's the Fisherman's Bend Authority or the state government, to tell them what's happening on their land. So, you know, we really do have no choice but to reject this, but we'll certainly follow this application as it progresses off to VCAT, as it inevitably will, and see what outcome eventually occurs on this site.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Councillor Crawford.
I find myself on this application as a councillor being asked to comment on a planning application that sort of falls short in many regards, but it is an example of many of the things we possibly will face in that end of town as a result of rezoning from industrial to capital city under a previous government without any of the necessary requirements for amenity of a new community. So I will be supporting the officer's recommendation, and I just wanted to note that it is very disappointing that there was a lack of foresight, or I don't know quite what the word would be, from the previous government to allow Fisherman's Bend to be rezoned without thinking about the amenity and the needs of future councils and residents.
Thank you, Councillor Crawford. Anybody else? No? Councillor Simic, would you like to close?
The applicant's frustration with the state government in not being able to articulate properly what the framework for Fisherman's Bend will look like in light of the vision was very clear today. As Councillor, I share the same frustration, noting that the framework's been delayed time after time, and we're now getting very close to the next state election, and wondering what impacts that will actually have on us being able to deliver on a Fisherman's Bend vision. So once again, it's very clear that this application doesn't meet standards, and as a result, it is important for us to support the officer's recommendation, but also I'd like to note, like other councillors have again tonight, the frustration that's felt with the state government with respect to delays around decisions for the area.
Thank you, Councillor Simic. I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Now we'll go now to 12 Spring Street East, Port Melbourne. And again, councillors, this was an item that was discussed today at our planning forum. And so we've heard from members of the public. So there are no members of the public that have requested to speak. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? Councillor Simic.
I've got a question following on from discussion that took place earlier today regarding the basement level. I was able to ask the applicants with their view of information that was presented by objectors around the impacts of the basement level and the sinkhole that it created as an issue. Wondering if officers might be able to comment on that and whether they're concerned about basement level.
Ms D'Alessandro or Mr Borg?
Through you, Madam Mayor. No, the matter's been investigated by Council's drainage engineers. They have no concerns in regard to a sinkhole in this location.
Thank you. Any further questions, Councillor? Councillor Crawford?
On my way here this evening, it's been a long day, I happened to drive past the location so that I could get a clearer idea of exactly where we're talking about. Now, I noticed there are a number of trees in the front yard that are currently at 12 Spring Street East. Are they of significant trees? Do they need to be maintained or protected in the building, in the new application?
Through you, Madam Mayor, as part of the application, no, the trees will not be retained. They are not classified as significant trees. There is a small setback in regards to this proposal, and there's going to be some form of landscaping to compensate for those trees.
Thank you. Councillor Brand.
I was unfortunately not able to attend the forum this morning, and I wonder if I could just ask just a couple of questions of officers, just to clarify a few points in the recommendation in the recommended conditions. What is the point? What's the point behind the finished floor level of the garage being at 1.9 AHD? Does that have to be, that's raised? Why does it have to be raised?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's in Council SBO, and that's a requirement through our engineers. It doesn't affect the overall height of the building. The building will actually be able to be compensated for that because the floor to ceiling heights are at 3 metres, so it can be compensated through that.
And I suppose I'd like to just ask a follow-up question: is if you can't have a garage at 1.8 metres or whatever, how can you have a basement which is lower than that? I'm just asking about the Melbourne water
through
type.
you, Madam Mayor, it's the opening of the garages from the laneway, so it's not about the basement itself. It's about the opening of the garage being at that level.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can you explain to me the maximum height of the dwelling to be limited to 7.88 metres above natural ground level? What is the reasoning behind that? And what is the general sort of height constraint there, sort of generally speaking?
Through you, Madam Mayor, the height is at the overall height of the building is recommended to be reduced to 7.88 metres, and that's as a result. It's recommended to remove the top floor level. So the current proposal before us is at 3 stories, and being in a 1- and 2-storey built form in this heritage overlay, it's recommended that the height is too high, and it addresses the streetscape and neighbourhood character, and it's recommended to reduce the height to 7.88 metres, pretty much at the top of the parapet at first floor level.
Sorry, could I just clarify my question? If there weren't a third story, if they just came along fresh with a new plan, what would normally speaking be the height limit that would be set on it under the current planning guidelines?
Yeah, the Res Code says 9.
Yeah. Through you, Madam Mayor, Res Code does say 9 metres. There is some discrepancy now with the recent amendment by the Minister, which has allowed 11 metres in a general residential zone.
So the difference between the 9 metres and the 7.88 metres is on the basis of?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's on the basis of the front elevation. It's on the basis of 7.88 is taken to the height of the proposed parapet, and is a recommendation to lop off the top or delete the top floor, and that brings us down to 7.88. So that's where that figure's come from. But if you're standing at the front of the site and you're looking at the site in regards to what you have around, you've got a first floor addition to the east, and you've got single storey on the opposite side, and it's a reflection of the streetscape character, but the 7.88 is taken from the top of the parapet of the proposed building.
Okay, I'll keep on going. The front wall of am I allowed to talk about the the alternative motion, so I can't. No? Okay, that's not on the table. Okay, then one last question about that is that if there was a desire by the developer to actually build higher in the middle of the block, but keep to a 7.88 parapet height, the extra height in the middle of the block wouldn't be visible over the parapet, for instance. Why would we rule out that? Why would we make it a 7.8 metre height right across the whole site rather than the apparent height as visible from all streets?
Through you, Madam Mayor, we'd really have to deal with the application that's before us, and what's been proposed initially was 2 3-storey dwellings. There was a change to 1 3-storey dwelling and 1 2-storey dwelling. We've done an assessment in regard to the streetscape, and we've done an assessment in regard to the heritage precinct that the site sits within. We believe a 2-storey development is workable. There is potential, if the applicant does wish to come back, with a 3rd-storey element, somewhere that's located in the middle, potentially somewhere that could be not as visible or more recessive. That's something that could be considered at a later time. But at the moment, we are considering what's before us, which is the 3-storey development. We're proposing to bring down a 2-storey development without trying to condition something that may or may not work.
Thank you. Councillor Simic.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I note that there was an original application that was granted for this location. Would officers be able to set out what some of the key differences between the original application and the application that's before us are?
What page was it?
Let's see. Page 2.
No, the table, that's all.
Hang on a table.
Through you, Madam Mayor, comparing the existing permit with the proposal, the overall height would be reduced from, so the current built form is 8.26 metres. The proposal with recommending reducing the height is 7.88. We have 2-car garage for each dwelling. The original one had 1 space per dwelling. Both approved development includes side-by-side. This development has angled roof form and a setback at the front. Permeability for this proposal is slightly higher at 84%, and this proposal has a basement level. So they're really the main differences. And there's also, this development is probably more contemporary than the previous proposal. And the starting point for this development is that we approved a development at 2 storeys, and that's why we're recommending 2 storeys again.
If I can follow up, Madam Mayor, just on that. So thank you for that overview. With respect to this application, given the similarities between what's already approved and what's before us, if we were to reject the recommendation and the application, and this were to proceed to VCAT, can I ask what your assessment is on what VCAT's likely response to the application might be?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that is a very difficult question to answer, because we would not be sitting in the shoes of VCAT. However, we think the recommendation that's been offered up by the officers is sound. We think also in relation to the fact that there is an existing permit on the land that has some similarities. In fact, it's got that 2 dwellings. This is probably an improved development overall. There's questions as to whether people would appreciate the appearance of the previous application as opposed to this one, which is a lot more contemporary. That's a question that is subjective in relation to that, but we think the recommendation as we provided is sound, so we'd assume VCAT would take that view as well.
Could the application change? Could some of the conditions that we've put on it be removed?
Through you, Madam Mayor, absolutely. There and certainly even some of the changes that were offered by the applicant could also be withdrawn if it gets to VCAT.
I have a question that I'd like to ask. I have concerns about the visual bulk down the laneway, and wondering what sort of articulation might be appropriate for that location, so there's not just one big sheer wall. Could it be set back at the upper level? Could there be additional windows? Could you give me some guidance about what, if should we be of a mind to include some further articulation, what that might be?
Through you, Madam Mayor, for starters, the recommendation is to remove one floor, so that reduces the height overall. Also reducing the height to 7.88 reduces the pitch, so again it reduces the visual bulk along the laneway. Our heritage policy does encourage height and walls on boundary as you would drive around in Port Melbourne and South Melbourne. So that actually does tick the box in regards to the heritage policy. There could be a better texture, and there could be possibly some more windows added to the side elevation towards the front, and there could be a slight recess from the front of the site setting back the first floor addition, but I wouldn't be encouraging a setback from the laneway itself, because our heritage policy encourages built form on the laneway, but there could be a recessed element from the front.
If I could add to Ms D'Alessandro's response, Madam Mayor, is that the applicant was very clear today at the forum, offering a half a metre setback. So if you set the upper floor back by half a metre to the lower floor, that could be achieved. There was also discussions around windows on that. At the upper level was a kitchen, so there could be another elevation, a window provided at that elevation, and certainly some discussion around colours and materials that the applicant was prepared to accept, if council was of mind to issue any new conditions in regard to some palette changes and tone changes in terms of the materials and colours.
So an additional kitchen window on one of the laneways would be appropriate, and you're saying that you wouldn't you wouldn't recommend a setback on the laneway for the second storey, but rather the front. Am I interpreting that correctly? And how big would that, would we go to 1.7 metres?
An additional, through you, Madam Mayor, additional 500 metres could be. Millimetres could be sufficient, and also getting that there's the window. The central window is slightly projected, 300mm over the laneway. That could be flush with the actual title itself, and also adding some sort of window, perhaps a highlight window, to the kitchen area.
Thank you, Councillor Simic. Did you have another question? Councillor Brand, sorry.
I'm sorry, but I do really want to clarify what plans we're looking at the moment. There are three sets of plans that I've got floating in front of me at the moment. There's one which was sent out to us. It's designed by Bassett and somebody, architects, which was the very original one, which was approved originally. So that's been looked at, and that's fine, that's understood. There's one now which has been circulated to me by Matthias Architects, dated August 2016.
Ms D'Alessandro, are you able to?
So
and on my screen here, I've got the one designed by Davidoff Partners, and that is March 2017. So can you just tell me what the difference between the last two is?
So through you, Madam Mayor, the first set of plans from the previous permit or the current permit, the second set of plans from Matthias Architects, that was the original application that came in before it went to the original advertised process. So it was very higher building. And then following on from our consultation April this year, we had a final set of revised plans, which is the Davidoff Partners Architects. They were revised in May this year, and they are the full set of plans that we are currently assessing in this report.
Okay, thank you.
Councillors, any further questions? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Councillor Bond.
I'd like to put forward an alternate recommendation.
Councillor Bond, could you please read your recommendation?
The recommendation is to refuse this application. 14.1, that the responsible authority, having caused the application to be advertised and having received and noted the objections, issue a refusal to grant a permit. 14.2, that a refusal to grant a permit be issued for the demolition of the existing dwelling, outbuildings and boundary fences, and the construction of 2 dwellings comprising a 2- and a 3-storey dwelling, each with a basement and a 2-car garage at 12 Spring Street, East Street, Port Melbourne. 14.3, that the refusal be issued on the following grounds. The proposal does not satisfy the relevant objectives and strategies of the Local Planning Policy Framework, LPPF, namely Clause 21.05-1, Heritage Clause 21.05-2, Built Form, Urban Structure and Character, and Clause 22.04, Heritage of the Port Phillip Planning Scheme. 2, the building scale and massing is contrary to Clause 21.05, Heritage, Clause 21.05-2, Built Form, Urban Structure and Character, and Clause 21.04, Heritage of the Port Phillip Planning Scheme. The height, bulk and appearance of the proposed development would not be in keeping with and would have a detrimental impact on the neighbourhood character and heritage values of Spring Street East. 4, the proposal is an overdevelopment of the subject site and would not be in keeping with the orderly planning of the area.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Do I have a seconder?
I'll second that motion, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl. Councillor Bond, please speak to your motion.
Thank you. This proposal is unsuitable to this location. The previous approved application was much more suited to the streetscape and reflected a few of the current attributes of dwellings found in the street back at it, such as the verandas, the weatherboard feel, and a few elements found in some of the other buildings currently on the street. This latest proposal does no such thing. Like Councillor Crawford, I also visited the street today, and it is a lovely street that is mostly intact, full of mostly one-bedroom weatherboard buildings, and of the 2-storey buildings that do exist in the street, they are all very well set back. They have minimal impact on the streetscape, and some of them you don't even notice are there. They're that well set back. So credit to our heritage people and our planners for their previous decisions in that street, which has allowed that to become a very well preserved street. Should we approve this, it would certainly break that character of the street, and it would, it would just not fit in with the current character of that street, and it would be a travesty to approve this, especially given there's just no reflection of any elements of the current buildings on the street. It's just, it is so out of character with the current urban character of that area. Too bulky, too high, not sufficiently set back. There's a whole list of things we could go on about this proposal as to why it should not be approved.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Councillor Pearl.
Thanks very much, Madam Mayor. I understand the risks of doing this with this matter in terms of the refusal, and I don't do this lightly, but the feedback from the community on this proposal has been overwhelming since the first consultation, etc. And I think it's well grounded in terms of the proposal we see in front of us today. All credit to the applicant in some respects for making the adjustments following the consultation as best as they saw fit. Quite often we don't see that occur, but in my mind the main points, particularly under 14.3, points 2 and 3 are the main reasons that I'm supporting this refusal. Particularly the bulk and appearance of the proposed development would not be in keeping with and would have a detrimental effect upon the neighbourhood character and the heritage values of the beautiful Spring Street East. I wholeheartedly support the refusal.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl. Would anyone like Councillor Crawford?
having visited the street, and during the forum today, I struggled to find the elements of heritage as referenced in this current planning application. I know I'm not the expert, but I think that we're not looking for mimicry or anything like that, but this just seems so out of place, particularly even in colour schemes, so I will be supporting the refusal of this planning application.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Councillor Simic.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I certainly take on board the comments that have been made so far and acknowledge that we've gone through quite a long process today with hearing from objectors and applicants with respect to this application. While there are some issues, serious issues with the application and the way it fits in with the rest of the streetscape, I think it is important for us to be realistic about, and as a responsible planning authority, take into consideration what the likely next steps are with this application if we were to refuse it. We heard from officers about what's acceptable. Today we also heard from objectors about what some of their major concerns are. I've got the list in front of me and I can go through it in more detail. My concern is that if this application were to progress to VCAT, that VCAT would approve the original application, or that it would approve a application with recommendations far less stringent than what we've proposed so far. So moving forward, I believe that we've got to tackle this matter head on and do what's best for the community, taking into consideration the huge number of objections received with respect to this application. I believe that there are other provisions, other requirements that we can include as part of the recommendation. And as such, I'd like to foreshadow a motion which looks at the recommendations that the officers have outlined and sets further recommendations which make the application that's granted stronger and hopefully puts at ease some of the concerns that the community has put forward. So in closing, I don't support this approach because ultimately I think it will lead to a much worse outcome for the community. Take into consideration the community's concern and would like to foreshadow an alternate motion.
Thank you, Councillor Simic. Councillor Gross.
Look, I'm not going to vote for Councillor Bond and Councillor Pearl's motion, but I absolutely agree with them in my heart. Everything you said is absolutely correct. But I believe that our duty is to do the... You know, I would throw it out in a moment, but I suppose I feel my duty, as Councillor Simic said, is to do the best possible result for the community. Now, the grim reality of life of an appeal at VCAT is that the one document that goes up to the appeal is the officer's report. So the officer's report will arrive on the desk of VCAT with the conditional approval recommended. And my sense is that that will be successful in getting over the line at VCAT. This is going to be a sophisticated applicant who will appeal. And so I just feel, even though my heart is really with you with this alternative recommendation, I just have to vote against it. And I know that Councillor Simic's foreshadowed motion may have some further protections, and this is one of those horrible times in council where you vote for something that you don't actually want, and that's what I'm going to do.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Councillor Brand.
Yes, I feel rather caught in this, and I've got a few observations to make. I really probably don't want to say which way I would ultimately vote without having seen the full extent of Councillor Simich's proposed alternative, because it might actually solve some of the problems that I have with this. I actually think in this particular case there's a lot about this building that
It's the red. In front of you.
Keep going, Councillor. Keep going, Councillor Brand.
There's a lot about this building that I like. In fact, I need to say, I think it's actually an elegantly designed building, and I think it's actually cleverly and well put together building. I have a lot of confidence that it would be actually quite a beautiful building, actually, in its own right. I think that it actually responds to historical types or historical motifs particularly well, but I do have one problem, and my instinct is to vote for it, is to approve it. But my one problem is that this area is an area of almost absolutely uniform tiny cottages.
Yeah, right.
Whereas this building, I think, is actually would be a beautiful building in a beautiful, very, very contemporary interpretation of an area full of stately two-storey Victorian terraces. You know, I would be just fighting tooth and nail to approve it, but I just think it's just because it's got historical references, it's not actually to the right history. The history of this is tiny workers' cottages in beautiful little uniform streets, and I think we've got to sort of honour that. I think that I think a lot of building bulk could actually be put on this block, and still achieve that sort of resonance with the small cottages. So I'm really not actually in favour of. I wouldn't support Councillor Bond's sub-clause that it is an overdevelopment of the site, but I just don't think it's actually hit the character and the heritage sort of requirements on the head. So I'm actually not in favour of it at the moment.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Councillor Baxter.
Yes, I'll also be speaking against the motion, and I'll share a lot of the same feelings as some of the other councillors. I certainly appreciate that this is there's been to me a very large amount of objections put in. It's clear that the local community feel very strongly about this development, but I also honestly believe that if we were to outright refuse it, we'd get rolled at VCAT and would end up with a much worse outcome, perhaps even the three-storey outcome, which I think would be disastrous. So I think it's actually our job not to sort of pass the buck and to try and get the best outcome, and that's why I think that Councillor Simich's foreshadowed motion, whereby we try to attach some more conditions to try and get a better outcome, I think is the way to go, rather than putting all of that at risk.
Thank you, Councillor Baxter. Anybody else wanting to speak? Councillor Copsey.
Yes, I also won't support the refusal. I consider that conditions will provide the best protection for some of the outcomes that residents were seeking today, that the City of Port Phillip can provide in our capacity as the current decision maker. So for that reason, I will await some detail from Councillor Simich as to the alternate motion should this current motion fail.
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. I will also speak to this motion and will say that I don't support the refusal either. I think the impact and the risk of it being refused is too great. I worry about this street. This is, I believe, one of the best street in Port Melbourne. It's a very quaint, very charming street. It's very clear what the residents are wanting. 71 objections, of which there are very clear 13 points, and I am confident that we could reduce that list down to only 3 that are outstanding, which I think would be a very good outcome here. Whereas if we refused it and it went to BCAT, it could be much worse than that. That list could be even longer. This is a 19th century intact street largely. This particular site does have laneways on both sides. It's not part of a pier. We're looking at the officer's recommendation of a height of 7.88 metres. I think that is a very good outcome. We've got 72% of the street being weatherboard. 70% of that street is single storey. I think if we could do a few things like lighten the tone, set back that front upper storey by half a metre, but which is more than like 1.7 from the front. I think not have any part of the building over the public space, reduce the visual bulk down the side, potentially by putting in a window up the top. The appearance would be significantly better. I think that's the option that we could possibly go forward with. And that's what we know. So I won't be supporting the motion either. Councillor Bond, would you like to close?
Yes, I would. My thoughts on VCAT are well known, and as far as I'm concerned, VCAT can do as they please, and generally do. I've heard the VCAT will approve it if we don't argument many times. And my view is I'm here to interpret the City of Port Phillip planning scheme as I see fit, not to try and preempt some VCAT decision that may or may not happen in the future. I've sat here in this council chamber many times over the last 5 years and heard panicked councillors saying we must approve this because if we don't, VCAT won't. And it goes to VCAT and VCAT refuse it. So I think this street is so intact, and everyone at the table agrees that this street is so intact. For us to sit here and try and redesign a building in a notice of motion when none of us have the expertise to do that, to throw all these changes into this current application in the hope that it goes to VCAT, then VCAT will agree to what we've designed round a table here, is just a ridiculous way to approach our planning and a ridiculous way to protect our heritage. Have some courage, refuse this, and have some faith that VCAT will see all the concerns that every one of you sees in this proposal and will agree with us that this proposal is inappropriate in this location, because every one of you agrees that that's the case. And what's it?
I'll ask the governance officer for assistance on that point. Councillor Bond is attributing things to other councillors and you should just speak for yourself.
I'll accept that. Councillor Copsey. Councillor Bond, please, for your own argument.
We all sit here, and the only reason this is going to be approved is because you're scared of what VCAT might do. Interpret the Port Phillip planning scheme as you see fit, not as you think VCAT are going to.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? All those against?
Division required.
Councillor Bond has called a division. All those in favour of the refusal? Councillor Bond, Councillor Brand, Councillor Crawford, Councillor Pearl. Is that right? I've got everyone? Yes. All those against? Councillor Copsey, Councillor Baxter, Councillor Gross, Councillor Simic, Councillor Voss. That motion's carried. Defeated. Sorry. It's backwards. Yes, it's defeated. Councillor Simic, you foreshadowed a motion.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And it is getting rather late. I'd like to thank the public for bearing with us. I'd like to move a alternate motion to include further restrictions and requirements on the application. I'll read out the additional sections in addition to A to D, which the officers have proposed. E, the front wall of the first floor level to both dwellings set back a minimum of 1.7 metres from the front title boundary. F, an additional kitchen window to the western elevation at first floor level. G, all windows on the western elevation to be contained within the title boundary. H. External materials to be finished in a lighter colour and or tone. I. A full schedule of materials, finishes and paint colours, including colour samples, in a form that's able to be endorsed and held on file.
Do I have a seconder to that? Councillor Gross? Councillor Simic, please speak to your motion.
Madam Mayor, it is a very difficult matter before us. We heard from the applicants today with respect to the issues raised, including keeping with character and integrity of the street, staying within height restriction, the fact that this is an imposing structure, setbacks to be consistent with the street, not supporting the basement level, overshadowing increase, excessive height, objects to contract construction, and several other points. I'd like to thank everyone who came and spoke with us today, everyone who put in objections regarding this matter. We do really take on consideration all of the things that people come to us with. I don't think that this is us being scared, as Councillor Bond has interpreted. It's about being a responsible planning authority. We've had our officers, who are in fact trained professionals with respect to application and development in our area, go through the application, come up with a number of restrictions on the applications which are very sensible, discuss with us further restrictions and recommendations that we're able to place on the application. I'd like to thank also the Mayor in the involvement in this process that she's had. I think we've spoken at length about this application. My concern is that we've got to be a responsible planning authority. We've got to make sure that we interpret the planning law, as Councillor Bond has said, in correct way. I believe that we've done that, and I believe that the further additions to the recommendations will make for a much better result, which does go to address quite a number of the concerns that residents have raised.
Thank you, Councillor Simic. Councillor Gross.
Well, this is a very troubling application for me personally, but I take Councillor Bond's observations really seriously. I think they're really well made. But in the end, I come down to the fact that we are exercising a quasi-judicial function, and in this judicial environment, we are supervised by VCAT. And that supervision, we can rail against it and we can work against it, and indeed I am, and you are. But it is a reality. And as much as I am troubled by disturbing this incredibly intact street, I feel a duty to make a decision which will stick and maximise the protections for the local community. And those protections are, yes, they've been workshopped quickly today, and there may be unintended consequences, but I see breaking up some of the massing with the additional window is justified. I'm particularly interested in the external materials and the lighter tone, so that it doesn't dominate by colour this street. This is the classic council conundrum, and I've decided on this occasion, notwithstanding a deep affection for the arguments that you've raised, to go with an amended resolution, basically to protect the community from what I see would be a more intrusive, less conditioned decision by VCAT.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Would anyone else like to speak? Councillor Brand?
Yes, look, it is very difficult, and you know, it's difficult on both sides of the argument, and I've got probably a third and a fourth side as well that I'm sort of trying to uphold, which makes it very difficult. I would not support this alternative motion. Mainly, well, it's not just the alternative motion. I think the whole motion all of the conditions that have been suggested here from A through to H, well, I is a standard one, I don't know why it wasn't included in the first place, but from A through to H, I don't see any of those conditions as actually improving the architectural response to the context. I see them as diminishing the architecture of the building. I think Councillor Bond's concern that it's designing, it's redesigning a building by people who aren't really qualified to redesign it, rather than putting the intentions forward. I mean, the intentions that was outlined in the potential refusal actually said what some of the problems were, and would maybe direct BCAT to address them. Whereas I don't think that these conditions actually address the problems. They tinker with the building. They diminish the architecture. In so diminishing the architecture, they might diminish some aspects, but I don't think they improve it in a positive way. So I can't really support it, even though in so many other ways, as Councillor Gross, for instance, has suggested, it would be quite an important thing to do to support it.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Any further questions? Councillor Pearl.
Thanks. It would be hypocritical of me to support this this motion, and I suspect we might be. I'll be the judgment of that one. I suspect we might be watching this from the chairs in VCAT in any case under this motion. So we'll see how we go. But I guess I would say is it does perhaps indicate that this our planning process internally within council seems to be operating reasonably well from a vibrant consultation to the process today, which allowed time for these alternative motions to be a bit more fully considered within the organisation with the broader community. So I won't be supporting the alternative motion, but thank Councillor Simic for taking the time to put it together.
Councillor Baxter.
I'll speak in support of the motion. Again, I think that this is a really important decision for us to make and for us to try and get the best outcome here, rather than simply saying we want VCAT to decide for us. I think that this is our job to decide, and that's why I think what we've got here is an attempt to get the best outcome that we can get, and so that's why I support the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Baxter. Councillor Bond.
Right. The original three-storey proposal we had would destroy the character of this very much intact street. The two-storey officer recommendation, which took a storey off that, would destroy the character of this very much intact street. And this alternate recommendation here before us, which is the officer recommendation with some conditions we've just made up in the last couple of hours, would destroy the character of this very much this intact street. So I don't see any real difference between these three proposals and the impact they're going to have on the street. They all have the same effect. I don't think we're lessening anything and gaining anything as a result of this alternative.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. I'll also speak. Today we heard in the forum from the community that came to speak to it, and we also heard from the applicant. And in the questions that we had from the applicant who designed this building agreed that he would be okay with some of these changes. It wasn't a problem. So we're not designing on the run as such. He actually agreed to this. I have to say, this application is within our rules and regulations, within our DDO. It's not something different or new or outside of those. I have to also say it is a really big conundrum for me as well. I love this street. Most people think this is one of the most desirable streets to live in. It's quaint, it's charming. But at the end of the day, this development is within its rights. It's allowed to be developed to that extent. I have heard from the community, we've all heard from the community, they would like a reduction in height. The development shouldn't exceed the height of the neighbouring property. Tick. They want the removal of the third storey. Tick. They want the change of materials to reflect the weatherboard's streetscape, where we're looking at a lighter tone there. A change in colour to reflect the predominantly white and light pastel colour scheme of the street. Again, we're changing the colour there to a lighter tone. A change of design to pick up the prominent heritage elements of the neighbourhood character. Well, we have a policy that we can't rebuild heritage. Has to be a modern building. But we are setting back the second storey so it isn't so imposing. A change in design to reduce the intimidating style and bulk of the building, with the additional window down the side to break up that large bulk and also the setback in the front. I think that's also a tick. Recessing of the second stories to be consistent with recessing of the second storey at neighbouring properties at 18 Spring Street. A removal of the projected aspect of the window over the lane next to 18 Spring Street. Obscured materials to be applied to the windows facing the lane next to 18 Spring Street. A change of design to prevent any overlooking and the rejection of any potential rooftop decks. These are all things that we've achieved in this, so there are 3 things on this list that still are not achieved, which the residents want, and I'll outline them. Rejection of the underground basement. Reduction in site coverage, so it's sitting at about 82% this building, and the removal of the street-facing balconies. So there are 3 things that the residents have wanted. So you have to say, if we reject this outright and don't approve this today, what are the risks? I think we've got a very good outcome here. It's not a picket fence, weatherboard, single-fronted, single-storey house. It's never going to be. So we're dreaming if we think that we're going to be looking at a development that will ever conform to that. It's always going to be 2-storey. So I'm going to support the motion that Councillor Simick's put up. Councillor Simick, would you like to close?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. That was an excellent summary, I think, of where we've got to today, and I hope that the community feels so too. As councillors, we are put in a very difficult position to interpret the planning scheme. I believe that we've done that and that we've done our duty with respect to this application. It's not possible under the planning scheme for us to have ultimate control over the design of a particular application, and that's what we're seeing here today. It is unfortunate, but it is the case, and we are a responsible authority. I'd very much like to thank all of the community once more for coming out today. As councillor, my duty is to the community first and foremost, and as a Gateway councillor in particular, incredibly passionate about our area and making sure that we have the best possible outcomes. More broadly, incredibly concerned about some of the development happening in the area, but we've got to take steps to address and look at each application on its merit. With respect to this application, I believe that we've worked throughout the day towards an outcome which does take into consideration a lot of the concerns that the community has and is responsive to the planning scheme. So I commend this motion to councillors and hope that they will support it.
Thank you, Councillor Simick. I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you. All those against? Which is probably superfluous. Andrew Bond, Councillor Bond has called for a division, so I'll ask for your vote once again. All those for the motion? Councillor Simick, Councillor Gross, Councillor Baxter, Councillor Copsey, Councillor Voss. All those against? Councillor Pearl, Councillor Crawford, Councillor Brand and Councillor Bond. That motion is carried. Thank you. Now we'll move on to the planning permits delegate report. Councillor Gross is rather eager to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Copsey. Councillor Gross, would you like to speak? No. Councillor Copsey, would anyone else like to speak? Then I will now put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you. Notices of motion. We've got 2 notices of motion tonight, councillors, and we have one person that's requested to speak to that. I'd like to ask so it's Councillor Pearl's notice of motion, and I'd ask Miss Vicky Myers, please, to come forward. Welcome back. If you, would you please state your name and suburb again? I know it's Melbourne, but
Vicky Myers, Melbourne. Yeah. And I guess what I want to say is I'm strongly in support of the motion that Councillor Pearl has put forward. As the St Kilda Road North area, bounded by, say, Kingsway, St Kilda Road, Queen's Road and down to Roy Street or whatever, makes the transition from being a mixed commercial and residential area to a largely residential one. I'd like to think that councillors, those voted by residents of the area, residents and owners of the area to represent their interests, would take responsibility for important decisions relating to planning permits, amendments to those permits, the local amenity, giving such matters the kind of consideration and scrutiny that we've just evidenced now, rather than delegating such decisions to officers. And that's said with all respect. At present, for example, 3 15 to 20-storey buildings are being constructed in immediate vicinity of one another, 2 on one side of Queen's Lane, the other one immediately across Queen's Lane. Given the sort of impact that that has had on people's lives for the past 20 months and will continue to do for at least another 12 months, I don't think you can really get a better example of major development than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Myers. Councillor Pearl.
I'll move the motion, so if that's okay. Yep. Did you want to seek leave on this item to ask questions?
After your motion.
You want to do that afterwards? Okay. I, Councillor Marcus Pearl, give notice that I intend to move the motion outlined below the ordinary council meeting, that the council determines all new planning permit applications that exceed 6 storeys in height in the area covered by sub-precinct 2 in Schedule 26 to the design and development overlay in the Port Phillip planning scheme for the St Kilda Road North Precinct.
Do I have a seconder? Councillor Simic. Councillor, would you... Actually, I will put aside standing orders right now and ask if anyone has a question regarding this motion. Councillor Baxter.
My question to the officers, Madam Mayor, is how many applications should we expect to see come across our desks?
A week, did you say, Councillor Baxter?
Just what is the increase in volume likely to look like in terms of this? Not that I mind, I just would like to know.
Thank you. Mr Borg.
Through you, Madam Mayor, look, it is a very difficult question to answer because we haven't seen any recent applications for some time, but we've had certainly have had a rush of about 14 applications in the last 18 months in relation to this. So there seems to be a bit of a slowdown since the Domain Station precinct works coming through. So we've noted it in this location, yes, when it rains it does pour, but again, we are well equipped to deal with the applications. We've got some relatively recent planning controls in this locality, which have certainly assisted council making its decisions.
Thank you. Councillor Brand.
Yes, I want to ask a tricky question because I don't know how else to put it, but I guess my fear that I need some sort of perspective on is the problem of exceptionalism, of making a much tighter and more elaborate planning process for some places as opposed to other places. And when I look at the 3D map that was in the briefing pack on Fisherman's Bend, which we previously considered this afternoon, and you look at the area depicting the St Kilda Road North area that we're talking about, compared to South Bank. Actually, I'm not quite sure I'm in the right.
What's your question, Councillor Brand?
I'm asking. I'm just trying to put in get some perspective on if we provide this sort of exceptional planning surveillance and decision-making processes to it. What happens to other areas which might have also similar or greater planning pressures? How does this sort of pan out in the way a planning department works and a council planning process works?
Are you asking about the workload and how they...
Yeah, I'm asking whatever the answer is. I'm not sure what the answer to that is.
However you want to answer that, Mr Borg.
I will answer in part, Madam Mayor. No, it's got. Sorry, I went from white to red. I apologise. Look, I mean, putting reports up to council take more time. Absolutely. Often they will involve a consultation meeting, which can take in the vicinity of 6 weeks to organise. Through our normal council process, there's probably another 4 to 6 weeks in relation to get them to council. So there is certainly an inherent delay and a longer sort of lead-up time. In saying that, if you're asking me the question as to whether this is required, I could say, look, council at the moment, under our delegations, the council can call in any application it wishes to call in. I'll just leave it at that, Madam Mayor.
Mr CEO.
Thank you. I just say, through you, Madam Mayor, it's up to the council to decide what are the trigger points in terms of the way it governs the whole city, and when you might delegate those back to staff when those conditions no longer exist.
Councillor Baxter.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Mayor. My question was to Councillor Pearl whether it would be appropriate to put in like a review time so that we review this and see whether we still need this in, say, 12 months' time or something like that.
I'll take that on notice. No, I'm only joking. Yeah, look, I did... let me answer the question in two ways. So I don't think the workload under this is going to be particularly onerous. So this doesn't cover the existing permits that are currently being considered by council, of which I think there's 11, correct, of which any councillor can currently call those permits in, and I'm reasonably satisfied on most of those. We're heading in the right direction. So it doesn't cover those. You've also got to keep in mind that the more than 20 permits that have been raised in this area in the past 3 years, plus the ones since the scheme was amended in the area, was an influx based around that scheme amendment. So the developer community was waiting for the scheme to be changed for certainty. The scheme was then changed, and then there's been a fairly large influx of planning approval. So I don't expect what you've seen in the past 18 months to be repeated in the next 18 months. I can't predict the demand, but I wouldn't expect that to be the same. So therefore, I don't think the workload under this motion is going to be particularly high. So if we set a time limit on this of, say, 12 months or 24 months, I don't really think we're going to actually, having considered that many permits, but the permits we do consider in this chamber will be critically important to the development of that area. So it's not that I don't think your point is not valid. I don't think it's necessary. If we did want to amend this, as in we were saying we were happy with what's happening in the area, etc., we could always put an alternate motion, sorry, not an alternate motion, but bring a motion to council to repeal this motion, which is how I would suggest we would deal with it.
Councillor Baxter.
Thanks, Councillor Pearl, and I appreciate what you say. My worry is not so much about the workload. It's that we're placing one area of the city, we're making special rules for it, and I think that that's warranted. But I do think that in any case, in any time that we were doing that, whether it was Elwood or St Kilda Road or anything, that we build in a review so that we don't have to remember later to take that off if we need to. We're prompted to do so, and that we go, okay, let's go back to not having those sort of special rules there. I'm probably not going to die in a ditch over it, but I think it's probably good practice.
So, Councillor Baxter, you're not asking for an amendment, you're just making a suggestion here. Okay, so we could do that formally. Okay, can you pop the microphone on because... Okay. Is there any further questions, councillors?
I don't foreshadow changing the amendment as it currently, the motion as it currently stands.
Any further questions, councillors? If not, we'll resume back where we were. Councillor Pearl, you were about to speak to your motion.
Gosh, now I know how the officers feel getting questions.
It's tough, isn't it?
It is tough, and I have a newfound respect for all of them. So thank you for the officers' assistance in developing this motion. Thank you also to councillors Simic and Bond, who effectively workshopped this idea based on one of the meetings we had in the residents with some of the residents from the affected area. So some key things. This motion is response to significant resident concern around this area, and it's aimed at ensuring that we get better community outcomes, particularly on the situations where perhaps even under delegation planning permits would be rejected or refused, is the correct terminology. This gives this group of councillors full transparency to be able to see what's actually happening and what the contents of the officers' reports are. That are all important, as we heard in the previous planning conversation, when you're being represented in VCAT. It empowers this group of councillors to increase the transparency of the planning process in this very highly developed area that's experiencing rapid growth at the moment. To give you some indication of the growth under our council plan that we've just adopted, Fisherman's Bend in 2027 is forecast under our council plan to have 12,417 residents. This area will have a total, the St Kilda Road precinct will have a total of 17,675 residents, a 45% increase. I think that sort of increase based in such a small area, to Council Brand's point, does justify having inconsistency, and I fully grant to you that this does create inconsistency, and it is going to create more work for this group of councillors. But the reason I think it has merit of doing it is to stop the mistakes of the past that have happened in that precinct, some within our control and some outside of our control. And given the density of development that's going on in that area, it's alongside the type of approvals that this council already considers at these council tables for Fisherman's Bend, etc. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl. Councillor Simic.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to thank Councillor Pearl in working with us to bring this motion. It is an important consideration for us to make. I know that historically Council went through quite a long process looking at the planning scheme amendment for the area. The recommendations, which were a result of community involvement and a very long process, were put to the Minister for Planning, and the Minister for Planning diluted a lot of the recommendations that Council had put forward, making the planning scheme weaker and threatening the development in the area. We are in a city, Melbourne, and there is a huge amount of development taking place. We have been meeting with residents in the area and taking on their concerns. It is important that we allow for as many protections and for as much consideration of matters as possible. I think Councillor Pearl's extremely correct in identifying that this is a highly developed and increasingly developing area. We need to have oversight over that and need to make sure that we're not burdening our officers or increasing the workload to a point that's unmanageable. But given how many applications are likely to be received, given past experiences, I believe that this is a manageable trigger point and one I'm willing to support. So thank you, Councillor Pearl.
Councillor Bond.
Just to point out, this is very similar to the current delegations we have in Fisherman's Bend, where all applications above a certain height have to come to us for us to approve even the rejection of those applications, as we did earlier tonight. That's only coming to us because we've got the exact same delegation over Fisherman's Bend that we have here. Also, I don't think it's relevant how many applications might come to us or how much work it's going to create. What's important is that we get better results and outcomes for this area than we have been in the past. We've been putting up some very weak conditions to VCAT at many of the mediations and compulsory conferences of late, and I think we can do better. It's not just about better approvals, it's also about strengthening the conditions that we insert into many of the refusals. And it's some of these weakly conditioned refusals that have caused much of the poor outcomes that have been achieved at VCAT, such as the one that was approved yesterday in VCAT for 37 to 41 Park Street. That's a perfect example of why we need to change the delegation to officers for this area so that all these applications come to us and we get oversight over the conditions that are inserted into them.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Anybody else wishing to speak? Councillor Brand?
Yes, I'm supporting this motion, even though I've got some qualms about the exceptionalism thing, but then I was a very strong supporter of the exceptional way that we're handling Fisherman's Bend, so wouldn't want to be hypocritical on that. And I think it's justifiable, not necessarily on a level of on the scale question, but I think that there are some definite sort of shortcomings that we've discovered. There's a sort of a shortfall of the sort of planning tools that we really need there, and it's on an emergency sort of basis, especially around the lane and and various issues there, which I think just does need emergency. Not protection. Yeah. We need to be looking at it very sort of front on, full on, and getting this bit right. And it's going to be a bit harder to do without full councillor engagement. So very happy to be supporting it.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Anybody else wishing to speak? I'll also speak. But before I do, I just want to take a bit of an issue with your percentages. Councillor Pearl, I think if you're looking at percentages with Fisherman's Bend, 300 with 20, there's a much, much higher...
7,000%, I think, is off a very, very low base, Madam Mayor.
Yes, so it's much higher there, but I absolutely agree with the substance of your motion. And I'd like to thank you, Councillor Pearl, for putting this together and bringing it to us tonight. I think it's incredibly important, and there is no doubt in my mind that sub-precinct 2 in the St Kilda Road North area has experienced incredible development pressures, particularly in the last 12 months. And I just went back and read some of the original documentation to the amendment, and I'll just read it out tonight. The northwest corner has a mixed character, and the northwest corner actually, so what we're talking about is between Dorcas, Kings, Wells and the rear of Palmerston Crescent. So that's what we're calling sub-precinct 2. It has a mixed character and a role, with a varying scale and quality of existing buildings and in many parts a poor quality of streetscape. This sub-precinct presents considerable opportunity for development, which is what we're seeing, and a change as a higher density residential or mixed-use enclave based around lively, pedestrian-focused streets. So then I thought, well, absolutely, we need transparency, we need great outcomes, and it's really important for all these areas. And we will never see the vision come to life in this area if we don't push, as a group, as all of us, for the best possible outcomes for our future community here. We've seen the gusto with which the development and the planning applications are coming in to change the area into this higher density residential mixed-use area. So I absolutely support your motion, Councillor Pearl. We need to support the officers, we need to support our community and get the very best outcome going forward. Councillor Pearl, would you like to close?
Only to say that the motion sends a very clear message to the St Kilda Road community that perhaps in previous councils hasn't got the attention that that community deserves, that we understand the needs and requirements of that area and we'll do our best to support our residents and our future residents for that area. And I thank the councillors that have provided their support this evening to this motion, and also thank the couple of community members that have hung around to hear the motion and to speak to the motion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl. I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Now we'll move to notice of motion number 2. Councillor Gross, this is your motion.
Okay.
Would you like to introduce your motion?
Yes, I gave notice that the following motion would be moved at the ordinary meeting of Council tonight, and that is that Council supports the intended advocacy effort of the Metropolitan Waste and Resource Recovery Group, Local Government Forum, to write to the Minister for Energy and Environment requesting that funds generated through the collection of municipal and industrial landfill levy be constrained to the purposes for which the levy was introduced, and raising concerns with the levy funds being allocated to Parks Victoria initiatives not related to the original purposes of the levy.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Bond. Before you speak to your motion, Councillor Gross, I would like to give the same opportunity as I did the previous one and put aside standing orders to allow for frank questions and answers. If there is any, councillors, do you have any? Oh, well, don't have to be frank, but, you know. Any questions of Councillor Gross's notice of motion? Councillor Gross, it looks like there is no questions. You may proceed.
Thanks. Our waste is largely combined with other members of the Melbourne local government community in a joint enterprise called Metro, I'll call tonight Metro Waste Group. It's a state instrumentality. So for a state instrumentality to embark on an advocacy effort sort of against the interests of the state is quite exceptional, and it requires explicit consent and direction from the member councils, and that's why we have to have a notice of motion in the public to have this advocacy effort run. This is a fairly benign advocacy effort because compared to other organisations like the MAV, who have run a trenchant campaign unsuccessfully for a few years on this issue, this is really quite benign. It's just asking for a letter to be written. So it relates to the landfill levy. $200 million is collected, and of that $200 million in the 2017 budget, only 4% was going to be allocated to waste management and resource recovery. So this is a question about hypothecation. How do you get good things to happen? And you get good things to happen by having a levy on bad things and then taking that money and expending it on good things. This is the carrot which we're not getting. And if I can just conclude by saying, just appealing to your venal self-interest, it is my hope and anticipation that this council will be trying to access a lot of this money to do some exciting things and necessary things, because for some time we've found it difficult to compete with more suburban councils because they can have green waste bin and thereby have high diversion of waste from landfill. So, you know, I think that we've got exciting ideas in both the north and the south of this grand municipality, and they need funding and they need to be externally funded. So I think there is some venal self-interest in us supporting this campaign by the Metro Waste Group.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Councillor Bond, would anyone else like to speak to this motion? If there's no other speakers, I will also speak to this motion. Thank you for bringing it to us, Councillor Gross. $200 million collected annually from the EPA landfill levies, and I think for the first time in a very long time we've seen some movement, and it's not from the Metropolitan Waste Group, unfortunately, that this movement's been seen. It's actually from the state government, from DWEL. So if you ask me, the Metro Waste Group is in a severe state of paralysis. So, Mr. Councillor Gross, I'm really happy to support your motion, but I really need proof that the Metropolitan Waste Group can deliver the goods. And I want to see that as much as anyone does. So I'll put out the challenge. Our community, and in fact the greater Melbourne metropolitan area, needs better and real solutions to waste. And I certainly agree with the independent finding that the funds are failing in the primary regulatory objective to be used for reducing disposal to landfill. That is serious. So we need to get serious, and the Metropolitan Waste needs to get serious. We have a high priority council plan agenda to transform our waste. A sustained reduction in waste is you know, what we've said. That's what we're going to achieve. And we also have action to work with the Waste Group to develop a business case to establish in a Metro organic waste management service. So I'm very supportive of your motion, but the onus is on Metro Waste to really pull up their socks and show us the goods, because I haven't seen it yet. So thank you. If there's nobody else that wants to speak, I'll ask Councillor Gross to close.
Well, Madam Mayor, I think you've played a blinder tonight. I really endorse you putting out that message in your public messaging post this meeting. And I think part of the issue is, if we're honest, that not only is it's just as much the fact that we haven't come up with shovel-ready ideas that really captivate the funding, the state government, and that's our challenge. And hitherto it hasn't been met by the Metro Councils or its organisation. And but I actually am quietly confident that we can, and particularly, you know, there's been a lot of intergovernmental excitement about the opportunities in Fisherman's Bend that need a lot of money from a fund such as the Sustainability Fund, and could have a profound impact not only on this council but adjacent councils. So thanks very much for your words of support.
I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Now we move to item 10, reports by councillor delegates. Councillors, are there any reports? We'll move to item 11, urgent business, which there are none, and item 12, confidential matters, and there are none. Thank you very much for your attention, and declare this meeting closed.